Welcome to Dan's Bike Show. I'm Dan. Today's episode is going to be a series of arguments supporting the building of a 100% US made bicycle. But first, this episode's bike story. I was having a discussion with this person about imported bicycle frames and why they're so cheap. I made the mistake of mentioning something about welding robots and they almost flew across the table at me saying, "Why does everyone think they have robots in China?" I don't know, I shrugged.
What do they have over there? A surplus of people or a surplus of robots?
People, I guess.
Then why would they pay to get a welding robot? Chinese welders are people. They're people!
It's a short story, but for me, it was a good lesson on assumptions that go unquestioned. The USA is a mature, industrialized nation. There is no reason why it should be impossible or even difficult to assemble a simple bicycle from all domestically sourced parts. According to the book Buffalo's Bicycles by Carl Bergwalt, in 1900, my hometown of Buffalo, New York, had 79 bicycle manufacturers. That's just one city. It was probably more difficult at that time to get an imported bicycle than to get a domestic one. We have the tools and skills we had in 1900. It's not like a library burned down and we lost the instructions to make bike tires. We have improved on almost all of the necessary technologies. We just don't do it anymore. If we were some small tropical island with an economy that was almost entirely dependent on fishing, it would be understandable that the raw materials and manufacturing capabilities are not available, requiring some or all of the bicycle parts to be imported. We are not a small tropical island. There's no good reason why we cannot do something, then we should be able to do it, right? Yet for some reason, the US made bicycle only exists in history. Therefore, my first reason for building a 100% US made bicycle, simply stated, is that it's stupid that it's this difficult, and I want to do my part to oppose stupidity. So stay tuned for future episodes. I'm just stubborn enough to succeed at what is supposed to be impossible. It should get interesting. If I buy products and services from my neighbors, my dollars are providing them with the means to buy products and services from their neighbors, which includes myself. This is simple economic self-preservation. If instead I get my fruit from Chile, my car from Korea, and my bicycle from Taiwan, those dollars are never coming back to me. Considering that the US government now counts hamburger assembly as a manufacturing job, it should be obvious that the rest of the world has no way to buy many of our goods and services. Those dollars are not coming back. From our own experience with microeconomics, we know that if we spend all of our money and we have no way to replenish it, we're in trouble. That should put the burden of proof squarely on anyone who claims that macroeconomics is so different from our experience that dollars don't need to come back. Until that argument is made, tested, and proven, I think it is safe to assume that buying domestically is a matter of self-preservation. During my first two arguments, you may have been thinking, but Dan, what about the cost? Sure, we can make bike tires here, but wouldn't they be more expensive? Or, those dollars never come back to us, but we lose less dollars because the products are so cheap, right? The first question to ask yourself is, are those products really the same? For example, I have a Stickley spindle arm Morris chair. I paid nearly $3,000 for this chair and ottoman. The design has been around for 100 years, and many of the chairs that were built 100 years ago are still here. When I was shopping for this chair, I did look for a less costly alternative. What I discovered was that if you sit in the discount versions and wiggle the arms, they move. The Stickley, however, is like a rock. No detectable movement whatsoever. So if you consider the life cycle cost, my chair, $3,000 divided by 100 years, is $30 a year. A $600 imitation import that lasts 3 years before the arms fall off costs $200 a year. The life cycle cost is 6.7 times greater for the import. I had a similar discussion with the vice president of the company where I work. He argued that product failures give you an opportunity to get the latest product. Having something that lasts is too much of a commitment for most people. Maybe after 3 years you want to remodel, and that chair no longer goes with the room. This is an interesting argument, but it agrees that the cheap alternative is not the same product. It agrees that the quality is not the same. It is a philosophy that supports higher retail sales. It is a philosophy that supports indecision. It's funny to me that my grandfather agrees with Fight Club. Ed Norton's character says, when you buy furniture, you tell yourself that it's the last sofa I'm going to need. Whatever else happens, I've got that sofa problem handled. My grandfather used to take me into the garage and say, look at this shovel, this table saw, or this wheelbarrow, whatever it was, and say, that is going to last 100 years. That was his only criterion for making a purchase. Will this product last 100 years? Maybe it's not the right question to ask depending on your philosophy, but I would like to suggest an experiment. From now on, every time you buy a product, ask yourself 2 questions. 1, where is it made? And 2, will it last 100 years? Or if you have an MBA, ask what is the life cycle cost? I would like to close this argument with a question. Who do you think is going to provide a better part? Take brakes, for example. Do you think Paul, whose name is on the product, will provide a higher quality product? Or a group of people in a faraway land who perform one process over and over all day, probably not even knowing what the finished product is? To me, the answer is obvious, but I would love to read your thoughts in the comments section. The second question you need to ask yourself when arguing for cheaper products is, why are the imports so cheap? Are they cheap because people are not being paid a living wage? Not every cheap product is made by some poor, exploited wage slave or child laborer, but some are. If you're not doing a background check on every product you buy, are you sure you're not supporting some form of social injustice? Think about if whatever product was made by someone paid enough for food, shelter, healthcare, transportation, 2.4 children and a dog, what would it cost? If that person made enough to live like a middle-class American, wouldn't the product cost more? I don't want to argue that the situation is so simple, but does buying the cheapest product mean that you're supporting some shady practices? I don't know. I'll let someone else figure that out. But until they do, I'd rather not risk it. I'm not ready to assume the role of human rights champion for the world, but I also don't want to have that weighing on me when I ride. When I'm on my bike, it's a happy time. I don't want to wonder if there's a 3-fingered child operating a drill press so I can have rims to carve some wicked switchbacks. That's a bummer, man. I'll pay more to know I'm not exploiting some kid. In the words of Flight of the Conchords, they're turning kids into slaves just to make cheaper sneakers. But what's the real cost? Because the sneakers don't seem that much cheaper. Why are we still paying so much for sneakers when you got them made by little slave kids? What are your overheads? I hope at least one of these arguments makes sense to you. To wrap things up, I would like to tie up a loose end from episode 1. I mentioned that I would try to use placeholders from Germany if a US part was not immediately available, with the intention of replacing the part with a US part when I'm able to make one. Reviewing the arguments I just made, the cost versus quality argument and the social injustice arguments are in line with German-made products. To a lesser degree, the stupid argument applies. You should also be able to make a 100% German-made bicycle. The difference is that you can make a 100% German bicycle. In fact, it could even be a multi-speed bike if you use a roll-off internally geared hub. The only argument the German placeholder contravenes is the self-preservation argument. But even that argument is softened, in my case, by the fact that my special lady friend is German. So in conclusion, German parts are reasonable for placeholders, although they do not bring me closer to my ultimate goal. Thank you for watching. I hope to see you back here on Dan's Bike Show next week.